Is the mic working okay? I can project my voice if you like. It's not a problem. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulih al-Kareem amma ba'd. How's everyone doing this Friday evening? Alhamdulillah. Good, good. Okay. So the topic as it was put forth was beauty in an artificial world. And you may be thinking, like, I'm not really sure where he'd be going with that. But I think you'll find it relatively beneficial, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. So I'll start off with a certain thought experiment. So back in 1982, there was a researcher by the name of Frank Jackson. And he did a thought experiment called Mary's Room. So he dealt with something known as the philosophy of the mind, okay? And he asked the question, is experience, is that knowledge? In the sense that we know that knowledge is taken in from things like, propositional logic, from reading, etc. But is your actual experience, does that add to knowledge or does that constitute knowledge itself? So the way this thought experiment was set up is, he said that imagine you had this woman named Mary and that she had been locked in a room for her entire life. And this room had absolutely no color in it. It was completely black and white. Now, Mary happens to be the world's foremost expert in color theory, neurological sciences, and a whole host of other fields related to the mind, neurology, and color. So she is the world's foremost expert. But she's been in this black and white room for her entire life. Now, if there's any question that you had about color and color theory and so on and so forth, she would have the answer. How does that function when it comes to the neurological functioning of the brain, the visual receptors and things like that? All of that, she's well versed in that. But like I said, she's been in this room for her entire life. Now, one day while she's working on her laptop, it actually malfunctions, and a red apple appears. So the question is, even though she's the world's foremost expert in color and neurology and so on, has she learned anything new by the presence of this red apple? And this is where you get into things like qualia, experience being actual knowledge. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because the world that we live in today, what you're going to find is that what we traditionally think of sources of knowledge are going to break down very fast. And typically I'm going to give a disclaimer here. This is the topic of my PhD dissertation, which I'm currently in the middle of. So I can be very passionate about this, but I've heard that usually when you're writing your dissertation, you're way more passionate than everyone else. So if you start getting bored, just let me know, all right? So the question that I'm mainly interested in when it comes to like artificial intelligence, when it comes to digital media, most people are interested in how information is transported. How do you get information from point A to point B? For me, what's more interesting is not the question about transportation, but of transformation. What does it do to the human being? And part of that is your very experience in the digital domain and soon to be the artificial intelligence domain. What happens to you? So the thing we have to understand before we get into how does the digital world affect you and how does artificial intelligence, how will that have an impact on you? Because it will have an impact on you, and we'll get into that in just a second. We have to understand that whenever you engage with any technology, you make something like a Faustian deal. You guys know what a Faustian deal is? You make a deal with, and you're not only taking something, you're not only gaining something, but you're also giving something up. And that applies to any technology, no matter how rudimentary it is. In other words, technology definitely giveth, but it also taketh. You give up a piece of yourself, and that's what I'm going to kind of show. And this is, I was just looking at, there's a new an app that I was just looking at earlier on. I think it was developed a little while ago, but I think they just brought it to market. It was by some ex-Disney kid actor. And this app, basically, you can take, let's say, with artificial intelligence now, you can take like 3 seconds of a person's voice and construct an entire conversation out of it. And not only that, if you have certain videos of the person, you can construct an entire artificial intelligence, image. So what this organization does is that you download the app, you feed in the information of one of your dead relatives. So let's say if your mom passed away some years ago, they can reconstruct an avatar of your mother. So if you see the commercial, it's really, really freaky. It basically shows this woman who's pregnant, and she's on the phone with her mom, and she can see her mom. And she's like, oh, it's kicking now. And her mother goes, oh, I remember when you used to do that, right? Why don't you sing it a lullaby and just hum to it? Now, the video, what that shows is it's not actually your mom because her mom's passed away. But basically, by curating all of the content that's available out there, everything from your social media posts, everything from your medical records, your legal records, all of your records, by curating all of that content, and they've got a voice analysis and video analysis, now they can put together something where it's like you're actually speaking to your mom. Now, the commercial is very interesting because she's telling her certain things about her past which only you would think she would know. You remember that one trip we had to Disney World? Do you remember when you were just 5 and I was trying to teach you how to ride a bike, you fell down and you came in? All of these personal things. Now, what's really interesting is that the commercial keeps going, and it shows that the mother, she's pregnant, and then she has the child, and then she introduces it to her AI mom, right, who's long gone. And then you find the kid himself starts to grow up. He grows up. He's in his, 20s, 30s, and he has a child. And he's like, my wife's pregnant. And where it started off was just sing him a hum. It ends off with the same grandmother saying, oh, just tell your wife to sing him a hum. I want you to imagine now that if you have, let's say, someone who's passed away in your family, think about that for a second. What sort of psychological damage do you think it'll do to people? The fact that they think that they're actually speaking to their mother or father or whatever it might be. Because at a certain point, you stop realizing that this is artificial. It's not real. It's very easy to get sucked into it. Like, I engage with ChatGPT, right? And I actually gave my dude a name. It's Greg, right? And so I'll chat with Greg, and I will treat it like a person. Like I think the other day someone said, you can pick the voices on ChatGPT. So I gave it an African American voice. I thought that was cool. It's like a deep voice. I like that. It's got soul. So I was like, I'm gonna pick the African American voice. Someone's like, you picked a black voice, and this is while I was engaging with Greg. I said, that is so racist. What will Greg think, right? But Greg's not real. Like he doesn't understand concepts. There's no understanding here. There's no consciousness. And yet, as a simple just me engaging with ChatGPT, how much more so if you were to engage with someone that's already passed away? What sort of transformational aspect will it have on you and your sense of self? So technology in any format, it will not only give, but it will also taketh. It will also take a piece of you. And what I'm going to argue tonight is that even the most rudimentary technology, even the most basic technology, that concept still stands. So I'll start off with what one type of rudimentary technology. And that technology is maps. So many of you have seen maps of the world, right? And, when you look at maps, what are maps in kind of a very simple way of understanding it? A map is what's known as analogical space. In other words, it takes your experience of space, it puts it in a type of analogy, it puts it as an example, it puts it as we would say as a mathal, and then present it to you like a small version of that. Now, when you think about where you are in space, like your spatial reality, you may not understand that maps actually impact where you think you physically are located. All right? We'll do a quick experiment on this. So, and it's interesting because when we think about concepts like cardinal direction, north, south, east, and west. So we think about North America on a map of the world. Is North America on top or on bottom? on the top, right? And South America is on the bottom, okay? And when you think about, let's say, I don't know, Asia, most of it, right? Asia is basically on the top, Australia is on the bottom. Now, is that map true? Like, is that an objectively true map? No. It's subjective, right? Because you had, within our own tradition, you had a cartographer by the name of Muhammad al-Idrisi in the 12th century in Muslim Spain who drew a map of the world as well. And his map was exactly opposite, i.e., when you looked at Europe, it was at the bottom, and Africa was on top, and Mecca was in the center. Now, the map that we rely upon today, that's what's known as a Ptolemaic map. So Ptolemy is the one that designed this map with Europe on top and Africa on bottom and so on and so forth. Now the question is, why did they differ on how they designed maps? Because it's interesting that Muhammad al-Idrisi actually lived in Europe at the time. He was in Spain. And Ptolemy actually lived in Africa, right, part of Egypt. So their own location didn't dictate that. What dictated where they placed what continent and how they mapped out land space was basically what they felt was dominant. For Ptolemy, the West, it wasn't Europe at the time, but let's say the Greco-Roman reality was, superior than all the rest of the world. For Muhammad al-Idrisi, it was the Islamic paradigm that was superior. So they draw maps in the exact opposite ways. Now, if you were to go to outer space, how would you know which one's right? There is no correct, let's say, objectively true map. Now, here's the thing, though. What's very interesting is they did some studies on how cardinal direction impacts our sense of space. And they looked at movers. And basically, what they found was, in the United States, you have moving companies that would charge, on average, $250 more moving items from south to north than north to south. Why? Not because there was more traffic going north, right? It was because of this idea or this perception that when you're going upwards on a map, it's like you're going up a mountain. There's an intuitive kind of difficulty in that. And they capitalized on that, right? It's like when you're going up a map, you think, okay, well, I'm going north. So intuitively, you think it's actually harder. And of course, going south is like you're going down a hill. So you think it's easier. So on average, and the name of this study, by the way, is called Northbound Fees, Southbound Ease and Northbound Fees. And it, again, measured vertical position and cardinal direction. So what you think of in terms of space, how you understand space is dictated by something that is external to you. So yes, maps are very good in terms of, guiding you and getting you to point A to point B. But your understanding of space has radically changed. Before you had maps, your understanding of space, or a person's understanding of space, would be very natural, very organic. Where they would travel is where they thought they were. But once you have a map, it starts to now dictate whether it's true or not, whether it's made to scale or not, right? And in fact, there is no such thing as a made-to-scale map to perfection, because the world is round, as we know, or oval, or whatever you want to say. And you can't really map out something like that when you flatten it out. So you have to, by necessity, make certain land masses bigger and others smaller. So it's never to scale. And yet, it has an impact on where we think we are in the world. So when you understand this, we understand every single technology has an impact on you. And this is just a simple example of space. The same thing applies to time. Clocks. With the advent of time, you find that your perception of time differs. So many of you might be familiar with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ says, "La taqumu sa'a hatta," and then he says the hour will not be established until, and he mentions a number of things, right? The proliferation of earthquakes, the increase in earthquakes, the increase in fitan, and so on. And one of the things he mentions, he says, "Hatta yataqarab az-zaman," until time becomes shortened. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the reason why. Or actually, he doesn't mention the reason why, but he basically says that time will become shortened. Time will pass more quickly. Now, the thing is, as a phenomenon, is that something that you experience? How many people have let's say, traveled to other parts of the world? Let's specifically, I don't know, Asia or the Middle East or villages somewhere, right? Did you ever notice that you sense and you perceive time a bit differently? Does time move slower for you? I think some of us say yes, right? And yet, when you come back to the States, things become kind of more of like a rat race, and it seems like time is moving quicker. Like you don't have as much time. Now, a lot of people like to say, oh, that's because the Muslims are all just lazy back home, and so therefore, that's why everything is just, they have two speeds over there, slow and stop. Khalas. So that's all. They're not moving quick. But the thing is, it's not just that. It's time actually, your perception of time is that time actually moves slower. Why? Because when you think about how clocks were introduced, again, another just a very rudimentary technology, they were introduced at the behest of Benedictine monks who had to measure their 7 daily prayers, and they wanted exactitude, which it goes back to a certain idea they had in Platonic theory, which I'm not going to get into, but they required they needed an exact time, right? And with a clock, this did away with the problem of water weights, which would freeze in the winter, or sundials, which wouldn't work when it's cloudy. And it gave precision. But what it does is it actually takes time and divides it artificially into specific units. Whereas the perception of time without a clock is solely based upon how you have your relationship with the cosmos, the sun rising and the sun setting. It's a lot more natural. And interestingly enough, when you ever read hadith, like for instance, speaking of time, when the Prophet ﷺ said, a time will come upon you when a year will be like a month will be like a week will be like a day, and a day will be like an hour will be like the flickering of a candle. Okay? And the word there is sa' for hour. Okay. When we think about an hour, what is an hour? How would you define an hour? Like 3 people said it. This is engineering college, right? Okay, how do you define an hour? 60 minutes, right? How do you define a minute? 60 seconds, mashallah. Allah grant you all good engineering jobs. All right, so you guys, you're on the dot, 100%. But the concept of dividing an hour into 60 minutes and 60 minutes into 16 seconds arises in 1348 in Germany, I believe it was. Before that, there was no concept of having time or hour, specifically an hour, being divided up distinctly into minutes and seconds. So when the Prophet ﷺ is talking about an hour, notice that the termination of that chain, where he says that year is like a month is like a week is like a day is like an hour is like the flickering of a candle, he attaches it to a phenomena that's something that's real and physical. In other words, the flickering of a candle. And most of the Sharia, when you think about it, it actually isn't attached to things that are artificial. It's attached to things that have to do with the cosmos. How you experience time is more real and more natural. So if you think about the prayer times, how are they determined? By the sun, right? That is a very natural way to determine time, as opposed to clocks and apps and things like that. And so we are, by our own Sharia, inclined more or attached more to the natural world. And again, if you remember what I was saying about experience and experiential knowledge is much more real and impactful than just calculation, or let's say propositional logic or something like that, right? And the Sharia kind of pushes you in that direction. When you think about the concept of death, for instance, there's a very interesting book called Will My Cat Eat My Eyes Out? Yeah, it's a strange title, but it was written by an author, Kathleen Doty, and she's a mortician. And she wanted to ask people about what they thought about death. You guys know what a mortician is, right? And we don't really have morticians in our tradition, but morticians are those people that kind of wax the body and suit it up, and so people can come and observe it. So they have to kind of the dead bodies, they kind of make them up so when people visit them, during their funerals, they can see them and they look like a nice state or whatever. And that's what a mortician does. So this mortician, she writes a book. She said, I wanted to ask Americans about death. And she said that most adults wouldn't even speak to me about it. She said we had this type of death illiteracy or fear of the concept of death that even impacted our very language. Like when you go to someone, and let's say someone has someone in their family has died, in English, for you to go to someone and say, "Oh, I heard your uncle died," it sounds very uncouth, very rude, right? You will probably say something like, "I heard your father passed. I heard your mother passed away. I heard your brother's no longer with us," right? Even within our language, the English language, and specifically within the American milieu, death is very morbid. It's something we don't really want to speak about. We're very distant from. So she writes this book. She says the only people that I could have an honest conversation about death was with children. So she started asking kids what kind of questions you have about death. So kids, they're very honest. If you know about kids, they'll say whatever, much to their parents' chagrin. But anyways, so some of these. So like for instance, one kid asked what happens if you're on a 14-hour flight and the guy next to you drops dead? What happens to the body? By the way, does anyone know? No, not you, man. I know you know. Does anyone else know? Anyone else know? 14-hour flight over the ocean. Where they can't land the plane. What do they do with the body? Okay, so here's the thing. I want you to imagine you're flying. You're going for Umrah. All right. May Allah grant all of you a trip to Umrah and have a Umrah, accepted Umrah. Allahumma ameen. So you're going for Umrah. You're flying from here to, let's say, a connection somewhere. I don't know, we'll say Dubai, all right? You're going to go from here to Dubai. It's a 14-hour flight, okay? 6 hours into the flight, the guy that's next to you, you notice he's not moving or she's not moving. And then you call the stewardess, and they found out he's dead. So now, for the next 7 hours, what happens to this dead body? Well, here's the answer. They take a nice cloth and they put it over the guy. And if there's no space, you have to sit next to a dead corpse for the next 7 hours, right? That is the answer to the question. So kids, they asked all sorts of questions. And one of the questions was, if I die, will my cat eat my eyes? Right? Will my cat eat my eyes out? That's why the title of the book is, Will My Cat Eat My Eyes Out? But one of the things she said that, Americans are by and large death illiterate. When you think about the Sharia now, again, going back to this idea of having this deep, innate connection with the cosmos, with the earth, with nature, with beauty and natural beauty, when someone dies, part of the Sharia dictates that you have relatives that actually wash the body. Sah walala. Is that true or not? Yes? Think about that as an experience if you've never done it before. It is a very surreal experience. It's a very visceral experience. It puts you in contact with death like no lecture can put you in contact with death. And there's a reason for that. When you think about Eid al-Adha, it is encouraged for you to do what? To actually go and sacrifice the animal. That puts you in contact with death in a way like nothing else can put you in contact with death. So my point is, when it comes to the Sharia, when it comes to our tradition, it actually is encouraging us to engage with the natural world. So, coming back to what I was saying, technology. Technology will always give, but it will always take. And so we saw maps on a very rudimentary level. Not only do they help us, but they also take away from our understanding of spatial reality. And that has real-world consequences. You actually pay movers more, $250 on average, because of cardinal direction based on a map that Ptolemy made, okay? And besides that, when you think about Google Maps, now it's like we've even shut off forget the concept of not knowing where we are in real space. Now we've added the concept of submission as well, right? So, your map says make a right, make a left, go straight, make a left on X street and Y street, and there you are, sami'na wa ta'na, and that's it. Khalas, you're submitting to the map, right? But anyway, so when we think about technology, we understand that technology, what it tries to do, and this is not only technology, but across many different fields, what is trying to be done is trying to give you an analogy of reality or representation of reality. and representations of reality in the Quranic discourse, they are what's known as amthal, a mathal. Why? Because a mathal is when you say this is like this. Right? So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا يَأْتُونَكَ بِمَثَلٍ إِلَّا جَنَّاكَ الْحَقِّ وَأَحْسَنَ التَّفْسِيرَ. Bring you a representation of reality, a mathal, except that Allah brings you the truth and the best explanation. وَأَحْسَنَ التَّفْسِيرَ, and the best explanation. So they have a certain representation of reality, and Allah brings you the truth, even though we know that Allah also uses, amthal, right? وَيَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ أَمْثَالَ لِلنَّاسِ, right? That Allah strikes representations of reality. For to know all of reality at once, it's impossible, right? I hope no one thinks that is actually possible. And if you're wondering, like, what would be an example of that, think about Musa alayhi salam in the Quran when he asked Allah, I want to see you, O Allah. What happens? Who knows? Does anyone know the story? What? Not quite. He did, that's true. That was the end point. Correct. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't reveal himself to Musa alayhi salam. He reveals himself. So Allah tells Musa alayhi salam, you won't be able to handle seeing me, but look at the mountain. If you can stand seeing the mountain, which I will expose myself to, which I will reveal myself to, tajalla is the word, then we will move forward. And so he exposes himself, the mountain crumbles, and Musa alayhi salam passes out. Why? Because if you think about it, just watching the mountain that is exposed to the reality of Allah, Allah is al-haq, that he experiences what you may call in modern parlance sensory overload. He wouldn't be able to handle it. So boom, he passes out, right? So the reality is only known to Allah, right? For us, the reason why Allah gives us amthal and gives us parables, examples, analogies, representations of reality, that is how we can have somewhat of an understanding of truth. But the issue is that human beings also bring representations of reality, also bring amthal. In the ayah that I quoted, that they do not bring you a mathal, they don't bring you an analogy except that Allah brings you the truth. What in the context of the ayah, the kuffar were telling the Muslims, were telling the Sahaba and telling the Prophet ﷺ, why didn't Allah send the Quran down in one shot? Why did he send it down piecemeal? Our understanding of reality, if it's really true that the Quran is true, it should be sent down in one shot. Why? Well, that was their own opinion. That was their own kind of how we think reality should work. And maybe they had a basis for it. Because when you think about the Torah and the Injil, that they were sent down actually in one shot, unlike the Quran. Does everyone know, do you guys know this? Yeah? Maybe. Okay, anyways. So maybe they had some evidence for it. And this applies to many domains. When people start talking about human rights, that's a mathal that they're bringing, right? When they start thinking about economic realities, when they try to talk about riba, like think about ribawi transactions, right? It's interesting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Baqarah, He says that الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا لَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كَمَا يَقُومُ الَّذِي يَتَخَبَّتُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ. That those who consume riba, that they consume interest, will stand on the day of judgment like those who have been driven to madness by shaitan's touch. Notice the reason that's given. And I want you to pay attention. The word that I was using was a mathal, a representation of reality, the mathal. So what does Allah say? ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ رِبَا. That is because they say that bay'a, that trade, mithlu riba. It is like riba. It is a reality, like, that trade and riba are the same thing. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues, He says, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. And Allah has made bay'a halal and made riba haram, right? Made interest haram. Now, if you really think about an interest-bearing transaction, let's just look at this from the vantage point of that which is real and that which is artificial. When you look at credit-based transactions, so right now we live in a world that is fully based on credit-based transactions, okay? The idea of financing an object there's a number of different theorists that have kind of traced where the idea of financing products came from. One theorist said that it came from a guy by the name of Singer, who was trying to sell his sewing machines. So you guys heard of Singer sewing machines? Maybe, right? So when he first started, when he first tried to sell them, he'd go door to door, and no one could afford paying whatever, the $400 at the time. This is like early 1900s or maybe late 1800s in the U.S. And so he came up with this idea that instead of having people pay $400 or $500 up front, we could sell it to them at a higher price over time and make a lot more money. And so instead of just making the difference between the cost of the product, let's say the labor to go into it, the cost of the actual raw material, and then you sell it at a slight whatever profit, now what you could do is, if you were making $100 off the machine, because you add time and interest-bearing transactions to say, we'll pay for it over time, now you can actually end up making $1,000 to $2,000, $3,000 off this machine, just based on interest. But here's the thing. Eventually what happens is, especially in an economy that works on profit maximization, the actual object becomes irrelevant. So because you make more money off the debt than you do off the actual selling of the product. And that applies to things like auto financing. It used to be back in the day that if you took cash to an auto dealership, you could get the best deal. Now that doesn't happen. Why? Because they only make money off of the debt. They will lose money if you give them cash. That's why they say that if you're ever going to make a deal, make sure you get all the sweet additions onto the deal before you tell them you want to pay cash. And even then, they may say, well, I can only give you this deal if you do it on if you get a loan on this. Otherwise, we can't offer this deal for your car. The thing is, they're not selling you a car, they're selling you the debt and the interest. And so now when you think about it, you have a real product, a sewing machine, a car, whatever it is. And then you have an artificial, financing transaction. So again, you have real and artificial. And so they go back and they say, well, it's like the same thing. When they try to convince, like, okay, look, aren't interest-bearing transactions just rent on money? You pay rent for a house, don't you? Shouldn't you pay rent for again, they're trying to now justify their method. Okay, anyways, moving on. So, that being the case, if a mathal is a representation of reality, what about the artificial world that we live in today? What about when we think about let's say the digital world we live in today? How much can we trust, let's say, knowledge from the digital world versus knowledge from, I don't know, other sources? You may think, well, look, I can look things up on whatever, Google, now ChatGPT, but we're actually missing a certain component. And that missing component is the experiential reality, okay? So what does it have to do with beauty? I guess that's the question. So can I do a quick thought experiment with you guys? All right, you can't participate. All right, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay? Ready? All right, I'm going to pick on anyone. So left side of the room, right side of the room. The word is art, A-R-T. All right, quick. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? First thing. Quick. Artist. First thing that comes to your mind. Painting. First thing that comes to your mind. Painting. First thing that comes to your mind. Mona Lisa. Okay, first thing that comes to your mind. Brush. First thing that comes to your mind. Creative. First thing that comes to your mind. Sister. What? Craft. Okay. First thing that comes to your mind. In the red thobe. Yeah. Paintbrush. Okay. First thing that comes to your mind. Man, just piggybacking on everyone else. All right. First thing that comes to your mind. Sister, right there in the corner. Creativity. Okay. First thing that comes to your mind. Go ahead. Raise. Yes. Beauty. Okay. Song. Okay. The good shift there. So I've done this thought experiment in multiple places, right, with crowds much bigger than this. And the thing is, most people, when they think, what the first thing that comes to their mind when they think about art, or let's say beauty or whatever it is, it usually has to do with something in the visual domain. I mean, at the end there, he said song, right? He had that saving grace. But usually, you give primacy to the visual sensation. Now, my question is, why do you do that? Well, one idea is that we are products of our environment. And we inherit a lot of our worldview from a European backdrop. So in Europe, when they wanted to now engage with the divine, this is in the pre-modern world, for them, as the Bible says, the word became flesh. And so when they wanted to understand the divine, when they wanted to understand God, they could make paintings, they could make icons, they could make stained glass icons and statues and things like that, because a representation of the divine, because that was what was core in their worldview at that time, was primarily visual. If you juxtapose that with the pre-modern Islamic world, you find that what was primary was not the visual, but the auditory. Why? Because the Quran is kalamullah. It is something you experience by way of sound. And even sound, when it's described in a visual sense, is done by calligraphy. And when you look at architecture, for instance, it's more related to the natural world, because the Quran pushes you towards engaging with the natural world. So what's a primacy in the pre-modern Islamic world was the auditory sensation, when they thought about beauty. And that makes sense because of the Quran, experiencing the Quran. So when we're in this artificial world where that you can speak to a dead relative, right? And how that'll transform us. You can engage with ChatGPT and think that they have feelings of racism and so on. Okay, when you start thinking about purchasing a robot that hangs out in your house, which by the way that's a thing now. It's not very good though, but it'll get better. And I was always telling people, I said, imagine you going to sleep at night and this really freaky robot's just looking at you as you're going to sleep. I'm not sure if I would even buy one of those, but fair enough, it'll get better. So as you start to engage in this artificial world and you start to lose a piece of yourself, how do you come out of it? Well, there's two ways. Number one is engaging more with the natural world. In other words, you can step outside. One of the things about Texas is that you can see the sky. You can see the stars. And a lot of us, because we're either engrossed in our phones or we're, whatever, we're in a hurry, time is of a premium, we don't just stop and say, let me just look up at the stars and the moon. Just that phenomenon, even for a few seconds, will have a deep impact on you, especially as we enter a world that is more and more unreal and artificial. You will have to do that. Why? Because your ability to discern truth from falsehood will get less and less and less. Your ability to engage cognitively in reality will not just be based on, if I think about it hard enough, if I have all the information, that I can come to the truth. It will have to be by some sort of experiential reality. And that's perhaps why, for instance, you have Umar ibn Khattab, who has a very interesting dua. He says, Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqa wa razukna ittiba'ah, wa arina al-batila batila wa razukna ijtinaba. Oh Allah, show me truth as truth and guide me towards it, and show me falsehood and falsehood as falsehood and take me away from it. Why? Because understanding truth and falsehood are not just about ratiocination. It's not just about calculation. It's not about digits and philosophy and propositional logic. It has to do not only with that, but it has to do with your spirituality as well. If you take spirituality out of the equation, you're not left with an understanding of truth. You're left with a type of myopia. So number one, it's engaging with the natural world in some form or fashion. But number two, perhaps more important, is engaging with the Quran. And here I don't mean just the arguments of the Quran. Like some of us, when we engage with the Quran, we want to say, okay, what is the Quran? How will Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala argue against this position or that position? How will he argue against the Christians or the Jews or whatever, yada, yada, yada. But there's not only just the phenomena of information that the Quran gives us, but there's also transformation. And I'll leave you with this one example. When you, and it's going to be a bit difficult, but hopefully I can make it as simple as possible. When you look at the English language, the smallest unit in the English language is a phoneme. All right, so for those of you, anyone studied English or English language as a literature, anything like that? Okay, anyways. So the smallest unit is a phoneme, okay? That's represented by orthographical descriptions of A, B, C, D, which is A, Ba, etc., okay? The smallest unit in Arabic is not a phoneme, but they're not phonetic, but they're mimetic. And what that means is, in the English language, the smallest unit, the A, Ba, Ka, etc., it has no meaning. It is meaningless. The smallest unit. The smallest unit in Arabic is not like that. It's morphemic, is the word I was looking for. In other words, even the smallest unit, because of the sound, it has meaning. Okay? It's onomatopoeic, as we say. So I'll give you an example of that. Okay. So when you look at something like Surah Al-Fatiha, to give something that we're all familiar with, and you look at the ayah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, okay? There's the meaning of the words that are there, right? Ar-Rahman, the one who is overwhelmingly merciful, right? Mercy has no limits, just overwhelmingly merciful. And Ar-Rahim, the one whose mercy extends. It goes on and on and on and on, okay? Now that's just a simple meaning of the word Rahman, Rahim. Now, if you studied, I guess, Arabic morphology, you know Rahman falls on something known as the fa'lan form. And the fa'lan form, a verb in that form, or rather a word in that form, signifies something that is heavy and intense. So for someone who's angry, he's ghadban, extremely angry. Atshan, extremely thirsty, right? Etc. Now, when you think about Ar-Rahman, it's extremely merciful. When you go to the term Ar-Rahim, it signifies a type of longevity. So it's on the fa'il form. The fa'il form is something that just continues. For instance, the word tawil, someone who's tall. You're not tall one day, short the next, tall the next. It's pretty consistent. If you're tall, you're tall, right? Now when you bring this to the ayah itself, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. So Ar-Rahman, the one whose mercy is like as if you were standing on the shore and waves of mercy are coming. And you're almost like drowning in the mercy of Allah. Okay, that's the kind of the sense that you get. Ar-Rahim is that mercy just does not stop. It goes on and on. You couldn't have a second without the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, that's the explanation of the ayah. But not only that, the onomatopoeic reality is part of the ayah too. Why? Because when you recite it, you recite Ar-Rahman. It's heavy. It's intense. Ar-Rahim. It's elongated. It's long. It's consistent. So the sound reconciles with the meaning such that it has an impact on you, an experience that you have, not just from meaning, but from the sound as well. So in this artificial world that we're now about to engage into and we're rushing towards it, you will have to not just have a relationship with the Quran in terms of meaning, but in terms of its recitation and it having an impact on you by way of the experience of the Quran. And that's something that's, just it's not comparable, right? I'll leave you with this last point because I know we're running short of time. A few years ago, I was in, where was I? Alabama. So Alabama, the MSA there, they're rock stars. They're probably my favorite, with all deference to the MSA here. But they're my favorite MSA in probably all of the United States, right? Even more than U of H, UT, And the thing is, the reason is because when they do programs, especially for non-Muslims, they're able to pack out auditoriums. It's crazy, right? Because it's really difficult for an MSA. You're part of the MSA, right? Yeah. So if you had a program for non-Muslims, It's difficult, man. Like, you might have like 6 non-Muslims show up at best or whatever. These people have like auditoriums full of non-Muslims. So I was like, man, these guys are great. So they invited me to a talk one year. And I was like, okay, that's fine. And so there were this group of, I guess, Christians in the audience, and they asked me about the preservation of the Quran. So how do you know the Quran is preserved? Now, there's a super technical way to kind of explain it, but I wanted to kind of make it a bit simple. So I said, look, the way we know it's preserved is through a process called tawatur, all right? And the way that works is, I want you to imagine now that the Prophet ﷺ has recited the Quran, or let's say recited some of the Quran to 10 people, okay? Now, if someone wanted to take something out of the Quran or add something to the Quran, what would they have to do? Let's take, again, a quick type of thought experiment. What would they need to do? If someone said, you know what, I want to take this out. Okay, so yeah, they'd have to get, let's say the Prophet ﷺ is alive. So they have to get the approval of the Prophet ﷺ. But let's say the Prophet ﷺ is not around somewhere. What else would they need to do? They would have to get all other 9 people to agree. Okay? So the Prophet ﷺ is still alive. So, you know, you could say that, okay, even if they tried to do that, maybe they would have some level of success. But when the Prophet ﷺ comes back, you'd say, no, that's not how it was, right? Let's say those 10 people each teach 10 people. Now, how many people do you have? 20? Each. Okay, yeah, 100. Okay, good. 100 plus the original 10. So you have 110. Let's say one guy wants to now take something out of the Quran or add something to the Quran. What would he need to do? 109 people, he'd have to get an agreement of 109 people. Let's say that those 100 people now teach 10 people each. How many people do we have? 1,000. It's an engineering college. You guys should be like on top of this. All right, 1,000 people. So you have your 1,000, you have your 100, and then you have your 10, right? One of them wants, and let's say the Prophet ﷺ now has passed away. What would you need to do to be able to take something out of the Quran or put something in it? You need agreement of how many people? How many people? Okay, even the majority. How many people would you need? A lot. Okay, we'll just say a lot, right? I mean, if you really want to be technical, you need 1,109 people, right? Something like that, because excluding yourself. All right. For those people who are married, who's married here? Y'all on the wall back there? You guys are married, right? Okay. So no, it's not because you're on the wall. It's just because I figured, right? You have a very mature, honorable look. So if you're married, right, and you guys can testify to this, let's say it's really late at night, and you guys are hungry, and there's nothing to eat. You and your spouse, okay? You said, you know what? I think we should eat out. Great. We'll Uber eat something. So if you start at 10 o'clock, how does that conversation go? The conversation goes something like, what do you want to eat? I don't know, whatever you want. You're like, okay, let's get some burgers. Nah, I don't want any burgers. Okay, well, what do you want? Well, whatever you want to decide, I just don't want burgers. Okay, how about tacos? Yeah, we could do tacos, I guess. So go to no tacos. All right. What do you want to eat? Well, I was thinking maybe we can get some sushi. You're like, man, I'm not in the mood of sushi. So basically what happens now is you start at 10 o'clock. By the time you reach a decision, it'll be 12 o'clock and nothing will be open and you're going to go sleep hungry. Okay? Why am I mentioning this? This is trying to get agreement with 2 people. 2 people. Let alone 1,000 people to agree with you on something of the magnitude of the Quran. Okay? My point in mentioning this, and I was telling this to the Christians, I said, what is really phenomenal about the preservation of the Quran is the further in history you are from the source, i.e. in this case it would be the Prophet ﷺ, the more certain you are that nothing's been taken out and nothing's been put in. Now, that's a great abstract thing to understand. Okay? And I started telling them about something called social ontology. Anyone know what that is? Social ontology is the phenomena that only exists because people have agreed it exists. So for instance, something like money. Yes, you have currency that's done by fiat. The government says this is $2. But if people didn't agree that $2 is worth $2, nothing would work. So that is by way of social ontology. It's a reality because society exists and because society has accepted it. So you have a social ontological phenomena when it comes to money. You have a social ontological phenomenon when it comes to language, right? Even though none of us sat down and said, okay, dog means this four-legged thing. That's not how language works. That's all part of social ontology. By way of social ontology, not only is the technical side of the Quran preserved, but also by way of the social ontological side. Now, I'm telling this to these group of Christians. There's about 10 of them. And as I'm telling them, I realized that the MSA that invited me there, all of the MSA members are gone. So I'm like, man, these guys are rude, right? Like, I mean, they invited me here all the way from Houston, and you know, I'm here, I'm their guest, right? And they're all gone. Like, where did they, like, what's up with that? They just left me here with these 10 Christians and they dipped, right? And then I remembered something. They told me that, look, when you're coming in, because of the way the dates are, it might be the first night of Ramadan. So what I realized was that they had all gone to the masjid to pray Taraweeh. And so I told these 10 Christians, I said, look, I explained you something very technical. Why don't you just join me now? So going to the masjid, and obviously this is the first night of Ramadan, it's not just the technical abstract understanding of the preservation of the Quran, but now they get to experience the lived reality of the Quran. And that's a completely different phenomenon. And that's something that we'll have to engage with more and more as the world gets more and more artificial. Real lived phenomenon, real lived experience. And part of that means that you'd have to increase in your own spirituality connected to the natural world. So coming back to it, connecting with the Quran, not just in what does it mean, that's important too, but also in its cadence, in its experience, in its recitation, and actually feeling it. And number two, engaging with the natural world. And engaging with as much of the Sharia as you possibly can, right? When you're helping the poor and the impoverished and things like that, when you're volunteering, when you're making da'wah and actually having real conversations with people, that has a lot of impact. Because we live in a world where conversations with actual people in the presence of actual people is a fading memory. Like if you think about the concept of communities, like before the digital age, a community, like if you lived in a certain neighborhood, what a community was that you had people of different opinions, different backgrounds, different political persuasions that would have an end goal of agreement. So you would be in an uncomfortable position to navigate and negotiate your own backdrop, your own worldviews, your own political views, and so on, to come to harmony. That was the end goal. That's what a community was. You start with differences, you come to harmony. Today, when you think about communities, online communities, you start with harmony. Think about it, right? So there's no concept of having difficult conversations and negotiating your worldview or negotiating political positions or social positions or economic or anything like that. And by the way, some people say that is the reason why people that are digital natives, that were brought up in the digital world, that's why they have a type of difficulty in social scenarios. That type of delayed adolescence, that's a phenomenon, right? Right? Social awkwardness. Why? Because of the effect of the digital world. In order to do away with that effect, you have to now start actually engaging with the natural world and engaging with actual people. And I'll leave you with this last hadith. The Prophet ﷺ says that المؤمن الذي يخالط الناس ويصبر على آذاهم خير من المؤمن الذي لا يخالط الناس ولا يصبر على آذاهم. That the believer who mixes with the people, in other words, has real conversation, has those difficult, navigating their opinions and everything, who mixes with the people and is patient with their harm, is better. And in one narration, أفضل من. In another narration, أعظم الأجر, has more reward. Many narrations, is better than the one who does not mix with the people, who stays isolated, just kind of in their own world, and who is not patient upon their harm. So having that real engagement with people, with the natural world, and the most important would be having that real engagement with the Quran. So I'll go ahead and stop there, inshallah. If you want, we can do some Q&A, or we can conclude there. It's up to you guys. Q&A, or you want to stop there? Going once? Okay. We'll do, how about like 5 minutes Q&A? Is that good? Wow, you guys are tired. Tough week? Isn't next week like Thanksgiving or something? You guys are going to be off pretty soon, right? Exams next week? Is that the deal? In 2 weeks. 3 weeks. All right. Okay, fair enough. What's your question? Yeah. Sure. Yep. Yeah. 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 Yep. Sure. Yeah. I think it has. Um, Expounding upon why may take me a little while. Because early Christianity was heavily influenced by Platonic thought. Platonic thought has this concept which is known as, for instance, Plato talked about the allegory of the cave, where he talked about a realm of higher ideals, which are like mathematical ideals and things like that, and then the kind of the realm of the material world. And this in his allegory of the cave, he said most people are in a cave and they're watching like a show on the wall of the cave. And if they were just to leave the cave, they would see that that's reality. So Christianity imports this idea and saying the world itself is actually of a lower quality. And that's why early Christianity had, when they started to talk about ranking things within the world, they would rank it based on how higher up they were. So obviously angels that are more ethereal, they were the purest forms of beings. But they even ranked things like vegetables. So, potatoes were the devil's apple because they were from the earth, right? So this sort of ranking and this Platonic thought, it was something that gets imported into Christianity. Tertullian now talks about it. And it's for this reason that when they started to think about anything related to the material world itself, they started to denigrate it, okay? And that's why when it came to intimate relations, they said the concept of lust itself was a sin. Like the feeling was a sin. And that led to a whole bunch of different problems, so they kind of rebounded and went to the other extreme. Different conversation. But what I was mentioning with that, I was talking about the Benedictine monks and their desire for exactitude. They needed things to be really precise. That comes from a Platonic background, to have absolute precision. And this can be very problematic. When you disconnect it from the cosmos and you want absolute precision, then what you start to do is you start to invent things like clocks. But clocks have another impact on how we perceive time. Anyway, so coming back to what I was saying, when I was talking about the English language, for instance, in the English language is much like Greek. And Plato, when it came down to the phonemes, he wanted them to be abstract and be meaningless. Why? Because that's more reflective of that higher world of ideals, okay? But the thing is, reality doesn't work like that. So if I was to like draw a triangle, right? How do you guys define a triangle? Since we're in a room full of engineers, or most of you guys, engineering college. What's a triangle? Any three-sided shape? Three-sided shape. So any three-sided shape that encloses it in itself. So is this a triangle? Like if I did like that? Very good. The angles add up to 180 degrees, right? So that is a precise definition, okay? In other words, anything that's a triangle is going to have three sides with three angles that add up to be 180 degrees, and only triangles will have that definition, okay? Now, that's precision. That's what Plato wanted. But he wanted that for everything, all right? That you have Triangles, a triangle is anything that's three-sided and adds up to 180 degrees, and only triangles are those things that add up 180 degrees and have three sides, okay? Can you do that with any other words? Maybe a square? Yeah, okay. Can you do that with a dog? Tell me a definition that you define it that it's only dogs and only dogs. You can't do it. If you try, you sit there, okay, well, it's an animal that has four legs. It has teeth. It has a snout. It has this. It has that. But you cannot give an airtight definition like you can, like the mathematical definition of a triangle. Now, this becomes problematic because language doesn't work with precision, okay? Language works on convention. And convention is part of your experience of the world. That's why the Arabic language is powerful, because definitions tie with the natural world. And you'll notice this anytime when you talk about something like aql, the word aql. You know, it actually has a source in the aqil, the thing that the Arabs tie on their head. What they used to use that for was to tie the leg of the camel so it doesn't run away. And so it's solid. So that your intellect ties you to a certain position. In other words, definitions are related to something in the real world. There's not the concept of abstractness. Abstractness, it leads to a type of artificialness. And Christianity inherited that. That's the short version of that. Yeah. Follow-up question?
Yeah, it was about the dog thing. I know you're using that as a specific example because you're trying to express that not every idea can be described with guiding precision.
Yeah.
But I would raise an argument that we have taxonomy and phylogeny and stuff like that to
Sure.
provide extreme specific examples of things that only count as dogs. Like you go down the phylogenetic tree, you exclude certain things, include others.
I disagree.
Well, what I'm saying is
You can. So you can go down that path, and what you're talking about is, yeah, you're talking about taxonomy, but taxonomy is used for bureaucracy. It's not used for an example of reality. In other words, it's used for the ease of categorizing things, which is fine. We're not saying that you don't. That's fine, but again, they're not going to be airtight. You will always find an exception.
Well, the argument I was going to raise was I feel like it's a problem of precision, like how much you need to include in order to be accurate. A dog is more complex than a triangle, but I feel like if you had enough qualities to list that are necessary to categorize it, then you could decide exactly.
Sure. You can give it a shot. Come back to me. Yeah, go for it. Just a dog. And forget like cats and dogs and wolves, and that's just the animal kingdom. Then I want you to define eyes and hair and teeth and nail and carpets, and give me like a triangle, give me a precise definition of all of that.
Well, one of the things was a logical one. It's that if you can define it by drawing such specific things, and again, I'm not capable of it.
Yeah.
But I think that someone who's more, versed in biology maybe could provide an
So
example.
I would say that no one learns language like that. Like that's not a phenomenon that where you actually learn that you start with definitions. Like even logically, like if you boil it down to a definition, how do you define a definition? Like eventually it falls apart. Language is not acquired like that. It's acquired in a very natural way. In fact, it's part of the fitrah. But then again, that's another long discussion. So we can tap that later on. But I will say that if you're interested in that, I'll challenge you, go for it. You as an individual, just one thing. Take a dog and try to define it. And see that you can fit every dog and only dogs into your definition. Don't think about it now. Just engage with it later. Yeah.
So when it comes to experience, how much weight would you give that as truth to other types of truth? Like, we would have Quran as top tier, and any type of empirical, objective truth that
Sure.
we can perceive. And the reason why I ask is because I use a lot of my experience contextually.
Sure.
Because for me, my experiences have been that when I go through the experience, I perceive it one way, and then maybe years now, once I remove it, I'm able to look back and I've learned other various things.
Sure.
I perceive that experience differently.
Sure.
It's much more subjective to me.
Sure.
That way.
Sure.
So in that type of regards, would you try to cancel out your experiences that you can prove to be more objective and kind of
So,
scenario?
right. So the idea with experience is that it is always going to be inner subjective, because it's only you can have that experience, right? So if you think about something like the color blue, Like the carpet's blue, right? Correct? We agree with that? Okay. But there's no way for you to know that the same blue that I'm seeing is the same blue that you're seeing. For all you know, right. So there's no way. I mean, we may both agree on the linguistic commonality of the word blue, but there's no way for you to access my inner subjective state to say this is blue. So when you say can that be objective, it's by definition subjective. It's subject to you. But that doesn't negate its truth value, if that makes sense. Because what you experience directly still has value, like we showed with Mary's room, that first experience I start off with, right? Now, the problem arises is if you try to say that you will only rely on experience, and when you start quarantining knowledge in one category, one camp or another, this is where the problems start. So if you say, I'm only going to accept something if it is rationally proven to me, that's a problem. I'm only going to experience something if I experience it, that's also a problem, right? You actually need to bring both together. So when it comes to the concept of yaqeen or certainty, Ibn Taymiyyah, he gives an interesting formula. He said that in order to get to certainty, or to get to like wisdom or certainty, you have to have what he says is aql sarih wa fitra salima, right? So it is a sound intellect and like a pure fitra. Like, so it's spirituality and rationality. And you're not going to now favor one over the other, but you need both in order to come to a sound conclusion about truth. Yeah, and different types of truth, I wouldn't use that terminology. I mean, truth is truth, right? Allah, there's... Sure. But even with that, you can get to a state of objective truth if you do add in, let's say, your rationality, right? In that case, you take your subjective experience and you add it to like objective truths, right? So for instance, the example that I gave with the Quran, there was the abstract understanding, okay, that's logical. There's a tawatur chain, that's the abstract rational understanding of it. Then there's the experience of the Quran, right? When you bring both these things together, it kind of takes you to a higher level of understanding truth. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. Yes. Sure. 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 Right. Okay. Sure. 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 So it's an excellent question. One of the issues that arises, so remember that thought experiment I did with art? It's a very similar phenomenon when we think about proof, because your environment's going to have an impact on you, right? Just like art, you prioritize the visual. So when people say like, look, there has to be proof that's presented, this is kind of a slippery slope, right? Because if you say, let's say just in terms of understanding rationality itself, that I will not believe something unless, I'm not saying you're saying this, but I'm saying, let's say a person says this, that I'm not going to believe something unless it's proven to me. Now the problem is, you can't prove things infinitely, right? You can't say because this, ad infinitum. There has to be something that you know for sure that you cannot prove, but you know it for sure, okay? In philosophy, those things are called basic beliefs, first principles, or axioms. Every system of thought has axioms, including science, okay? So what would be the first principle or the axiom in science is that nature is uniform. There's no way to prove that. Yes, you could do experiments and, see it over and over again, okay? So when I say nature is uniform, when you mix hydrogen and oxygen, what do you get? Water, okay? If you mix hydrogen, oxygen again, what do you get? Water. If you mix it again, what do you get? Water. Okay. Now, we would say that that is a piece of knowledge, but that's based on observation. So you might have done this, and in fact, many of us don't even do the experiment ourselves, but let's say we did do it, and you did it 1,000 times. Is this really knowledge, or is it justified belief? Because we've seen it enough times. Sure. Sure. So, okay, so here's, again, coming to like sources of knowledge, right? When you say evidence presented to you, what is the evidence that's presented to you? Take the example of water, like the one I just gave. All right, so what's the evidence here? Sure, we understand hydrogen, we understand covalent ionic bonding, we understand, sure, we all that stuff. Okay, sure, okay, sure. How do we know that? Or specifically, how do you know that? Other science, okay. So you know that, you personally know that by way of testimony. Okay. So what makes one category of testimony at a higher epistemic level than another category of testimony? That would be a question. Okay. Have you engaged with the evidence directly? Okay. But like again, the evidence based on what? Like hydrogen, oxygen make water. Fair enough. All right, but that's based upon the observation of bringing hydrogen, oxygen together. That's pattern recognition. Fair enough. Now that makes a lot of sense, but have you done the experiments yourself? No. You have to trust the say-so of the scientist, correct? Now, the process makes sense, sounds great, and it sounds logical. Is that enough for you to say, okay, that's acceptable? Right? So if mutawatir works in this domain, why doesn't it work in this domain? Right? But what I was actually saying was a different point, by the way. I mean, even though testimony is a good thing to speak about, what I was saying is that when a person, again, not you, when a person demands proof, we have to be very clear on what they mean by proof. Okay? If they're saying that I don't want to believe something unless it's proven to me, you have to then ask what constitutes proof. Right? Certain things are just not provable. So that principle that nature is uniform is not provable in science. You cannot prove that as a principle. All you can do is observe it over and over and over again. So let's say that I mix hydrogen and oxygen, and I've done it 1,000 times, and I've personally observed it, let's just say, right? You can say that because I've seen it so many times, I now believe it, right? And we have a system of hydrogen and oxygen. We know the molecular structure. We know, how they're bonded by covalent ionic bonds, whatever it is. I haven't studied chemistry in a while. Anyways, so whatever it is, and I've seen it 1,000 times, but now just because I've seen it 1,000 times, does that mean it is actually knowledge, or is that just justified belief? Okay? Because I've seen it 1,000 times, I make the assumption nature is uniform, meaning every time I mix hydrogen and oxygen, it will guaranteed give me water. But the only way for me to know that's true, absolutely, with no doubt, is when I actually mix the hydrogen and oxygen. And there's no way for me to know that the next time I mix it, I won't get milk. No, but again, it goes back to justified belief, right? Because you start off with axioms, things you know for sure that you can't prove. Again, science has this axiom. Science doesn't work unless you have this axiom, that nature is uniform. If you break that down, then science is gone. If you say that one day I can mix hydrogen and oxygen, I get water, and the next day I can mix it and get milk, Khalas, you're done. You can't really go anywhere with that. So you have to make that assumption, but that assumption is not provable. Similarly, when it comes to even your most basic understanding of reality, the real world exists. That's an assumption. There's no way to prove that, right? Other minds exist. No way to prove that, okay? But those are things you know for sure because everything else breaks down. Logical principles. You know, there's no way to prove logical principles. You have to start with logical principles, right? If I said I'm a married bachelor, you might be like, well, that's crazy, right, guys? If I said I'm a married bachelor, is there something wrong with that statement? What's wrong with it? It's an oxymoron. What if I said I think contradictions are beautiful, I love oxymorons, I'm fine with it. I'm a married bachelor. Prove to me that I can't be. You would say, no, that goes against the principle of mutual exclusivity. But if I said, prove the principle, you start with the principle. So you can't take proof back to Never Never Land. You can't say, because at the end of the day, if you say I can prove everything, I'm saying I'm doubting everything. But if you doubt everything, you have to then doubt your doubt, which leaves you intellectually paralyzed. So just like within science or these things that sound really nice, right, because they're empirical, because it's part of a worldview that we've been brought up in, if you don't go down to the metaphysical reality that what are the assumptions, like I was mentioning yesterday, the assumption is nature is uniform. But that assumption can logically be broken. And this is why someone that takes the assumptions of science has a really hard time with things like miracles, right? Miracles. Like if you think about the birth of Isa alayhi salam without a father, right? In science, you say mother, father, child, mother, father, child, mother, father, child. Now this is a pattern. That's how science works. It doesn't work deductively, but inductively. It works on patterns. But once the pattern's broken, science can't really say yes or no. Unless you have like a logical problem, but it's logically possible that you can get a child from, missing a father, logically. So you have to now question the assumptions that it's built upon, No worries, inshallah. All right. I think that was a good last question, inshallah. By the way, we have a section, if you go to a course called The Divine Reality on the Sapiens website, there's a section on the philosophy of science. I'd highly recommend you take a look at that. You can download the book for free, and there's a section there on the philosophy of science, and the course also covers that as well. All right, no worries. sapiensinstitute.org. So SAPIENCE, sapiensinstitute.org. This is a comment or a question, because that was the last question. Okay, it's going to be quick? The website, okay. So he wrote that one, yes. Yeah, alhamdulillah. All right, we're going to stop there. JazakAllah Khair. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu